Welcome back everybody to our studies in AQA A-level history. This lesson is going to focus specifically on the political developments that take place under the Prime Minister tenureship of both Gladstone and Disraeli. This involves a conversation about liberalism, conservatism, and the basis for their support, as well as the ongoing conversation we're going to have relating to the growth and the extension of the franchise. Let's first begin with the Liberal Party, the Prime Ministership of William Gladstone. Now, William Gladstone was an individual who served as Prime Minister on four occasions, separate occasions, between 1868 and 1894, and he was the quintessential figure of what we would probably describe as classical liberalism as it pertains to 19th century Britain. His political views were rooted in the belief in individual liberty, in free trade, in limited government, and in constitutional reform. And so his political ideology can be characterized by a number of very specific ideas. Firstly, political reform. He was committed to extending democratic rights, including reforms to the electoral system and greater accountability for government officials. His Liberal Party was dedicated to advancing the principle of government by consent, emphasising the idea of parliamentary sovereignty and the need for MPs to represent the broader public. Additionally, he believed in the ideas of free trade as being the cornerstone of Britain's economic policy. Gladstone sought to reduce government intervention in economic affairs, advocating for low taxes and supporting policies that would benefit individual enterprise. He also was a strong advocate for ideas relating to religious freedom and was determined to reduce the influence of major religious institutions, such as that of the Church of England, in public affairs, as well as supporting the disestablishment of the Church of Ireland. And then one of the major questions that we're going to be concerning ourselves in at multiple different stages throughout these videos is the question of Ireland and Irish Home Rule. Gladstone became increasingly committed to the project of Irish Home Rule, believing that Ireland should have its own parliament to govern domestic affairs. This was a divisive issue, and it remains a divisive issue throughout quite a lot of the period of history that we're going to be studying in this series of lessons. But nevertheless, it is the case that Gladstone pushed for reforms that would grant greater self-rule to Ireland. The kinds of things that we see under Gladstone include things that push for the greater franchising, expanding of the vote. So although the Great Reform Act of 1867 was an act that was passed under the Disraeli government, Gladstone was a strong advocate for expanding the franchise, and he later championed further extensions to the vote. So Gladstone's political reforms are also evident in his focus on improving the electoral process. So, for example, the Ballot Act of 1872 introduces a secret ballot, which aimed to reduce voter intimidation and corruption. Under Gladstone's government, we also see the passing of the Elementary Education Act in 1870. This is a piece of legislation which established the foundation for public education in Britain by creating school boards to manage elementary education and provide for state-sponsored schools. There are various different Irish Land Acts that are presented and that are passed in the 1870s and in the 1880s. These are a number of reforms that were aimed to address the plight of Irish tenants. So the Land Act of 1870 and the Land Act of 1881 both sought to address issues such as land tenure and tenancy rights as it pertained to Ireland, although it was not until later that more significant reforms were enacted under the influence of Irish political movements, which we'll get to in future lessons. By contrast, then, Benjamin Disraeli was the prime minister who served very briefly in 1868, and then as the result of the resignation of Lord Derby, and then he gets kicked out in 1868. But then he returns from 1874 to 1880, and ultimately he was the leader of the Conservative Party, and he becomes a pivotal figure in the development of modern conservatism in Britain. Disraeli's vision of conservatism was a lot more pragmatic, a lot more reformist than the traditional aristocratic ideas of conservatism that previously had defined the Tory party. So one idea here is this idea of one nation conservatism, the concept of a major ideological contribution. This is the emphasis on the importance of social cohesion as well as national unity. Disraeli believed that the rich and the poor in society were deeply interconnected, and that the government should aim to protect the interests of both of these groups. Disraeli was also a fervent advocate of imperialism, and he believed that the British Empire was crucial to the nation's strength and crucial to the nation's global influence. His policies were marked by a desire to expand British influence overseas, and we see this through a number of different implementations. So, for example, his intervention in what is known as the Eastern Question, which is the sort of question concerning the decline of the Ottoman Empire, as well as the purchase of shares in the Suez Canal Company in 1875. In terms of social reform, while conservative in many aspects, Disraeli believed that the government had a responsibility to improve the conditions of the working class and to extend the benefits of civilization to all citizens. This reflected his support for limited social reforms, especially as they relate to areas such as housing and labour regulations. So we've already mentioned a couple of reforms and changes and policies made under Benjamin Disraeli, but let's go into a little bit more detail. The greatest achievement must arguably have been his contribution to the Great Reform Act, the Reform Act of 1867. This is the second Reform Act, which expanded the electorate by granting the vote to many urban working class men. Disraeli's reform was a response to the growing demand for greater political participation and concerns about social unrest. Now, while Disraeli was not initially in favour of this idea, the idea of expanding the franchise, this is obviously quite a liberal concept, he came to view the reform as a means of not only diffusing political threats, maintaining public stability, but also with the expectation that once the resignation of Lord Derby takes place, that he would win the election of 1868, which in fact he does not, and we see this not actually result in the kinds of results that you would expect. And so he's only in power, and his party is only in power towards the end of that period, and then we get Gladstone, of course, and then we get Disraeli back in the 1870s into the 1880s. And so we have to jump to 1875 when we see another major legislative change under Disraeli. This is the Public Health Act. Now, this marked the beginning of a significant change in public legislation as it concerns health in Britain. It required that local authorities ensure the provision of clean water, of clean sewage systems and sanitation, and help improve the public health conditions, particularly when thinking about the rapid growing urban areas. That same year, we also get the Artisans' Dwellings Act, which allowed local authorities to clear slums and to build better housing for working class people, reflecting Disraeli's commitment to improving the living conditions of the poor. The most significant development in British political life during the leadership of both Gladstone and Disraeli is, of course, the extension of the franchise. And we've already spoken about the Reform Act. This is passed under the Disraeli's Conservative government, and it extends the vote to urban working men who were householders or those who were tenants paying at least £10 a year in annual rent. What this did, while not expanding the electorate to a universal scale, so women weren't included and people who paid less rent were not included, or people who weren't homeowners weren't included, but it still nevertheless expanded the electorate by around 1.5 million men, including those of urban working classes. This reform was a response to pressure from working class movements, including things like the Chartist movements and other reform groups who demanded political rights for working classes. And while, like I said, it did not grant universal suffrage, it nevertheless represented a significant broadening of the electorate, and the working class became a crucial force of British politics. Under Gladstone, we see the representation of the People Act of 1884. This extended the vote to rural working men who were householders or tenants paying £10 or more in rent, similar to the urban reforms that we see with the Reform Act of 1867. So the 1867 essentially says that if you are an urban man and you are paying £10 in annual rent, or you're a householder, you get to vote. The Representation of the People Act extends those exact same characteristics, those exact same requirements, to that of rural people. And so it essentially allowed for farmers and people in rural environments to have this same kind of representation. The electorate was then extended again by a further roughly 2 or so million men, making it more representative of the male population. By 1885 then, we can see that the electorate had nearly doubled since 1867. The electorate was composed of around 5.5 million men at this point, but it still nevertheless excluded women of all kind.